Hey, thanks for checking out my podcast. I pray that God encourages you and enriches your life through this content, and really that you would just hear from Him today. For more information about me or to read my blog, you can visit my website at bryceharperministries.net. Thanks for stopping by. God bless. We are in Esther chapter 7. Esther chapter 7. If you remember last week, we left off with Haman setting up a public murder of Mordecai, right? But instead, he ended up throwing Mordecai a one-man parade, right? So he had plans, and then they really just completely fell through, because he went to go ask the king, "Hey, king, I want to go hang this guy," and then the king is like, "Hey, Haman, I'm glad you're here. I have a question. What should I do for someone that I really want to honor?" He's like, "Oh, forget my plan. I want to cash in on you wanting to honor me, king." And so he comes up with this elaborate plan, and he's like, "Okay, now go do that for Mordecai." So he's like, "This is not how I expected this day to go, right? It's not what he was planning to do." So, and we left off, if you remember, it was Haman just utterly humiliated, talking to his wife and his knowledgeable friends, and they're like, "Oh, you're in trouble." And then the king's eunuchs show up to drag Haman off to dinner again, right? Because remember, there's two dinners. They went to one dinner, and the king's like, "What do you want?" And she's like, "Come back to dinner tomorrow night." Like, okay. So that's kind of where we left off, and we're going to pick up in Esther chapter 7. Again, I'm reading out of the Message version, so it's going to look a little different than yours, but it's on the screen if you would like to read it from there. Starting verse 1. So the king and Haman went to dinner with Queen Esther. At this second dinner, while they were drinking the wine, the king asked again, "Queen Esther, what would you like? Half of my kingdom. Just ask, and it's yours." So the second dinner wrapped up, and the king's like, "No, like really, what do you want? Like for real, what do you want? And don't ask me to come to dinner again." Right? That's kind of like that moment where something I heard in a sermon from Greg Mott, he's a pastor over at First Baptist, really kind of helped me understand the king's perspective, which I thought was interesting. And his point was the king was really curious because he's like, "You risked your life to come ask me for a favor. It probably wasn't to go to dinner." Right? I mean, they're married. They probably had dinner before. So he's like, "You didn't come ask me for dinner. What is it that you want? Like, let's be serious, don't waste my time," kind of thing, right? Get down to business. Let's figure out what's going on. So he's like, this favor must be pretty big, Maybe that's why he offered half of his kingdom. He's like, "I'll give you up to half of my kingdom." So she's like, "Oh, okay." He's willing to grant my request. Like, okay, he's actually willing to do this, so I can just ask. I can feel comfortable to ask him. Maybe he's like, "Don't be embarrassed. Don't, it's okay to be vulnerable. Just tell me what you're asking for." So, in verse 3, Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your eyes, O king, and if it please the king, give me my life and give my people their lives. We've been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, sold to be massacred, eliminated. If we had just been sold into slavery, I wouldn't even have brought it up. Our troubles wouldn't have been worth bothering the king over." So here it is. She lays it all out on the line. Because if you remember, up to this point, no one knew that Esther was a Jew. Right? Not the king, certainly not Haman. Right? Would he have dared to raise an annihilation campaign against the king or against the queen and her people if he knew? Right? Like, if everyone knew that Esther was a Jew, would Haman have said, "I want to kill all the Jews"? Probably not. Because somebody might have been like, "Dude, like the queen is a Jew, right? Like, that'd be really dumb of you to do that. Like, the woman that he chose out of his entire kingdom to be his wife, maybe you shouldn't pick on her. It's not going to end well for you, man." But he didn't know that. He didn't know that. So I think she's kind of playing on the king's pride a little bit. I think she's doing kind of two things. I think she's remaining humble, but she's also kind of playing on the king's pride a little. Right? She said the only reason that she dare ask is because it's a life and death matter. So she goes on to say, if we had just been sold as slaves, I wouldn't bother you with this. It's kind of a bold statement. I mean, these are people, right? They have lives, they have jobs, they contribute to society. They're people. And she's like, if we'd have just all been sold as slaves and taken somewhere else, I wouldn't care. I wouldn't bother you with this. Which I'm thinking to myself, okay, that's a pretty bold statement, you know. It's interesting to me that she would say that. The point she's making is, if this was just a quality of life issue, I wouldn't bother you with it. This is not a comfort thing. This is not, give me something so I'll feel better or this or that or whatever. Because he's offering her what? Material possessions. And she's like, this isn't about that. She's like, if it was, I would have asked you a long time ago. I'm not gonna bother you with this. I'm not gonna make a big deal. I'm not gonna come to you, and interrupt your day and risk my life to say, we've been sold as slaves. She says, no, it's a big deal, right? He's a busy guy, so maybe she was just being humble, but I think she was trying to stroke his ego a little bit. I think she was trying to say, oh, you're just so busy. I didn't want to bother you. Women never do that. They're like, oh, you're just so, I didn't want to bother you with this. You're too busy.
Are you saying they have an agenda?
Yeah. Sometimes. Never. Women never have an agenda. Never, ever, 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 ever. But I'm pretty sure that if his queen were sold into slavery, that'd be a big deal. That'd be worth discussing, right? Like, if she really was sold into slavery, she'd be like, oh, I'm not going to bother the king with this. Just, I'll just leave. And he'd be like, where did Esther go? Who sold her into slavery? Why didn't she talk to me? Right? That would be kind of a big deal. I think she would have brought that up. I think I'm not saying she's lying, but I think she's saying, let me paint you a picture of how serious I feel about this, right? This is a big deal to me. So, verse 5 is where it gets kind of interesting to me. King Xerxes exploded. He said, who? Where is he? This is monstrous. He was angry. In anger. He exploded in anger. Right? So this is Esther's moment. Here it is. Right? Let's just imagine the emotion of the moment for a second. So she's about to call out the man who her husband, who is the king of Persia, by the way, trusts so much that he has made second in command and given his signet ring to. He gave Haman the right to send out orders, send out things in his name, and sign it as the king. So that's like the president allowing you to text or tweet somebody from his phone and sign it, the president. He's saying, I'm authorizing you to speak on my behalf. Right? That's what it's like. Now, that's the president. If your parents say, oh, will you text that person back? It's probably somebody that they know well. If it's like a coworker that they don't know all that well, they're not going to let you text them back. They're going to be a little careful with what message they send, right? But the king's like, here you go. Here's my signet ring. Just go ahead. Probably because he didn't want to be bothered with it. But either way. So, Esther is about to make him choose between his right-hand man and his wife. She's kind of throwing down the gauntlet here. And that's why she invited Haman. This is a face-to-face encounter. They're both there. It's not like she went to him in private and was like, oh, king, Haman's so mean. He did this, he did that. And he's like, okay, I'll take care of him. No, they're in person. So she's looking King Xerxes in the face, and Haman is sitting right next to her in this moment. That's pretty intense. That tells you kind of how bold Esther was, because Esther's like, bring him too. Let's talk about it. Which is crazy. So think about it. Haman is at a pretty low point in the story. Remember, he just gave a one-man parade to his arch nemesis. And he's listening to Esther whine about her problems. He's just like, oh my gosh. Oh, you poor people. Oh, poor you. I got problems. He's probably kind of tuned her out by now. Probably kind of ignoring her. because he's just thinking about himself, right? He's thinking, I can't believe I just drugged this guy all the way through town. I hate this guy. I cannot wait till the day that I get to kill all these people because he's made me even more angry. So I think, needless to say, that Haman is going to be very shocked by what he hears, right? Because he has no idea that Esther is a Jew. And then when he sees how, the king responds to her statement, he's probably like, what? Who is this? Who did this? So if Haman's not paying attention, he's probably paying attention now just because the king is angry, right? You ever do that? You kind of tune your parents out, and then one of them gets angry, and it gets real, and then you're like, what's going on there? Let's see how Esther replies to the king, because remember, the king just said, where is he? Who is this? So what's she going to say? An enemy, an adversary, this evil Haman. They're sitting at the table, and she points at Haman and says, this guy. Talk about drama. Haman was terror-stricken before the king and queen. The king, raging, left his wine and stalked out into the palace garden. You guys know how much he likes to drink, and he left it in the room. Because he just realized, I have to make a decision. Because Esther brought this to him, and she just kind of pulled him along, and he gets so angry, and now he's got to deal with that emotion, right? Because if she'd have just kind of said it at the first dinner, he'd have been like, ooh, this is tough, I don't know. I mean, you are the queen, but, my harem is pretty full. And Haman does all the work for me. But what do we know about the king? We know he's a drunk and he has a bad temper, right? So she gets him to this point, and then she says that, and he is just livid. So the king, raging, left his wine, stalked out into the palace garden. Haman stood there, pleading with Queen Esther for his life. He could see that the king was finished with him and that he was doomed. Wow. What a difference a day can make. So if you thought Haman was humiliated before, now he's kind of begging for his life, right? And I think what they're talking about here is like his life in the material sense of being like, oh man, what am I going to do now? What am I going to, I'm not sure if he thought the king was going to kill him at that point, but I think he was like, man, this is my job. This is all my livelihood. This is where I get my money from. Like, how am I going to continue without the king's favor? Kind of thing, right? So he is bowed, groveling at her feet. So it's amazing that Haman, the guy who was so proud he wanted to destroy an entire race of people just because one of them wouldn't bow to him. Now he's bowing and begging for his own life. I think that's interesting. If you remember how we talked a few weeks ago about how fickle people can be. Remember when we said that? How it's kind of like the wind, it just kind of changes like that. Well, here it is, right? There was a time, get this, when the king didn't even know Esther's name, didn't know her face. If she would have come to him, if she would have barged in earlier in the story, he'd have been like, he wouldn't even look at her. He'd be like, just kill that woman. What is she doing here? She's crazy. How did she even get in here? Because he didn't have a relationship with her. He didn't know her. So whenever that stuff was happening, like, who are you? I don't care. But now he has a relationship with Esther, right? Now they're married. And that to us, the principle that we take away from that is a problem with living your life to try to please a crowd or to try to please a certain person. Because things happen that change the way people interact with you. Right? People's day will determine how they treat you a lot of times, right? I mean, you've been there. People have a bad day, you kind of leave them alone. You're like, oh, okay. They have a really good day and you had a bad day, you're kind of like, leave me alone. I don't want to hear about how great your day was. Mine stunk, right? I failed a test. I forgot about a test and I showed up and I got a C because I didn't realize it was today. And everybody was like, oh, I got an A+ on that test. And you're kind of like, leave me alone, right? Gotta like just walk away. So if you're just trying to impress people and you just want people to like you, and you don't have a backbone, you don't have any substance, when their minds change and you don't keep up or change your lies to match, where are you? Right? They're going to be done with you. So when you see a certain person and you're like, I am going to do whatever it takes to make sure this person likes me all the time, that strategy is always going to fail you. Now, if you surround yourself with people who are going to like you for who you are, even if you have a bad day, that's not what I'm talking about, because you can be real with those people. You don't have to pretend like you had a great day every time. You know? And I think for us, a lot of times as Christians, we think that God doesn't realize that we're upset. I think sometimes we think that God doesn't understand our circumstance. And we're like, oh, okay, I got to pray, and so I'm going to turn off all this anger and all these emotions that I'm feeling, and I'm just going to utter some words that I think God wants to hear because I read it in the Bible or I heard it in a song. So I'm just going to recite some things that I've heard, and hopefully God will be pleased with that prayer, and then I'm going to go back to my emotions. When God's like, I created you. I know who you are. I understand those emotions. And when you shut that off to God, you're not communicating with Him. You're not really praying. You're just saying empty words. Now, if you go before God and you're like, God, I'm angry. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to verbalize this. I don't know what I'm feeling. I'm just feeling it, and I don't know how to deal with it. And it's freaking me out, or it's really angering me, or I just don't want to deal with it anymore. And I think that's what Amy Grant's song is about. That Better Than a Hallelujah song you said you didn't like. I think that's what it's about. I think it's about saying sometimes God wants you to be very real with Him because He knows. And when you're fake with Him, He's like, this is fake. If you've ever read the book of Amos, I mean, it's talking about this fake worship, like these ceremonies and these big events, and God's like, but you don't live that daily. Like, this isn't your lifestyle. You're just coming together and putting on this big show thinking I'm impressed with that. He goes, I'm not. I'd rather you live righteously. I'd rather you just live in righteous injustice. I'd rather you just do what's right than come to me with all your songs and all your praises and all that stuff. It's like, that stuff is great with the right heart, but without the right heart, I don't care about it. It's not pleasing to me. And so sometimes it is better to just go to God and say, I don't even understand. I don't even know how to communicate this to you. Because it's better than being fake. It's better than not going to Him at all. Right? I mean, I really think that we in our human selves believe that we can't go to God until we feel better about ourselves. Well, I have a news flash. You're not going to feel better about yourself or your situation if you're not in communication with Him. Because He's the one that's going to help you understand what's going on. So if you're just fake the whole time, what kind of relationship is that? He's offering you something so much better. He's offering you so much more than just some empty relationship. Because He's not fickle. He doesn't change. He's not like us. We're the ones who change on Him daily. He never changes. And to go back to the story, the king knew Esther. Right? She is the one who remained herself and humble, even with a crown on her head. That crown didn't change who she was. Her situation didn't change who she was. It changed things about her, right? Changed her address, for sure. Changed a few things about her, but not her character, not who she was underneath all that. She was still the same person, right? His affections had changed, and a woman who would have meant nothing to him now has his undivided attention. Now has access to up to half of his kingdom. Which was a big deal because, I mean, his daddy and granddaddy and great-granddaddy are the ones who fought for that kingdom, not him. He inherited all that. He's like, I'll give you half of it. He's like, you didn't earn that, right? You're just giving away something that you didn't earn, right? And that's how big this story is. That's how big this interaction is. He's like, no, tell me what's bothering you. I don't want you to be upset. If I can fix it, I want to. And so that's what he's saying to her. Right? So just a few chapters ago, Haman was in the same boat, wasn't he? The king didn't even ask. Haman came and said, there's a certain group of people that I don't like, that we need to get rid of? And the king's like, whatever, dude, just go do it. He didn't even ask him who it was. He didn't care if it was the Jews or not or anything like that. Gave him the signet ring. He said, if it's bothering you that much, Haman, take care of it. Because Haman had used, not really fear, because I don't think the king was afraid, but he manipulated the king to make him think that these people were not contributing to society, that their customs were weird, and that they were, causing trouble in society. And really, they weren't at all. Right? So he made him believe things that weren't true about this people group, and then just said, we just need to get rid of them. He's like, whatever, dude, just go do it. Right? And we're talking about humans. We're talking about human life here. And the king was like, just take care of it. But, just like Esther, now Haman's true colors have shown through. So just like Esther was herself, and then when the light shined on both of them, Esther was who she was, and Haman was this little sniveling coward. Because he wasn't standing there all proud saying, oh yeah, king, let me explain to you why you need to kill her. No, he was like, oh man, I stepped in it now. Because now, not only does Mordecai, the guy who started this whole thing, by the way, not only does Mordecai have a great standing with the king, now you're telling me that the queen is also a Jew. So Haman realizes that two of the people closest to the king's heart right now are this people group that he has decided to annihilate. And he's thinking, this is not going to end well. Right? This is not going to go well for me. Now, we talked about a little bit earlier, the king likes his wine and he loses his temper a lot. So let's see how that plays out for our boy Haman. As the king came back from the palace garden into the banquet hall, Haman was groveling at the couch on which Esther reclined. The king roared out, will he even molest the queen while I'm around the corner? When that word left the king's mouth, all the blood drained from Haman's face. So the king is so mad, he gets up and leaves the room. And he comes in to that. Right? I mean, talk about bad to worse. Because the king was already mad. Now he's absolutely livid. Now he's like, oh man, next level kind of angry. No, groveling, like begging. Like she's on the couch. And he is like right next to her, very close to her. And so when the king walks in, he thinks that Haman is up to something else. He doesn't necessarily think that Haman's begging for his life. He's like, what are you doing that close to my wife? That's what he thinks is going on. So Haman went from worrying about like his material life to like, oh man, like I'm going to die and it's going to be bad. Right? All the blood drained from his face means he went white as a ghost. So we don't know exactly what this scene looked like, but it didn't look good for Haman. Right? The king obviously thought that Haman was up to something. He didn't like where Haman's hands were, if you know what I mean. He says, you're getting a little close to my wife. Verse 9. Listen to this. Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs attending the king, spoke up. Look over there. There's the gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai, who saved the king's life. It's right next to Haman's house, 75 feet high. The king said, hang him on it. So Haman was hanged on the very gallows that he had built for Mordecai in the king's hot anger. So I find this part somewhat humorous. Harbona is like, look over there. Right? Wasn't that convenient? Haman had a gallows built for Mordecai. And then he found himself on it. It makes me wonder if maybe Harbona had something against Haman. Right? Because he's kind of quick to speak up. Right? The king's still mad. He's like, oh, I better say something now. I don't like this Haman guy. Right? Because if you remember chapter 2, right, the king had a habit of exploding in anger and then coming to his senses. Right? Because he was mad at Vashti, so he banished her. And then it said his mind started to change toward what he did to Vashti. And then what happened? His guys step in and are like, hey, you can't go back on that because now we have complete control over our wives, so you can't soften, king. Let's find you a new wife. So Harbona is like, I see how this works. The king gets mad, and if you don't act in his rage, he'll calm down. You know? So, it's like Harbona saw an opportunity and knew the king needed to act now if he was going to, and so he's like, I don't like Haman, so get it done. So understand this. I'm not advocating acting in rage. I think that's a terrible thing, right? Xerxes is not a Jew. He doesn't have a relationship with God. But Haman needed to be dealt with, right? They had to deal with Haman. And that's how God chose to deal with him. Because if the Jews were going to survive, Haman had to be out of the picture. Because Haman's not sorry what he did. He's sorry he got caught. I'm sure none of you are like that. Right? I'm sure you never apologize after your parents catch you instead of being like, I did this and I was wrong and I'm sorry. I'm sure it was one of those things that you're like, if I get caught, I'll apologize for this. But if not, no one's going to ever know that I did this. So Haman's not sorry for what he did. He's sorry that he got caught. That's it. So on one night, Haman went from beaming with pride to humiliated to terrified, and then impaled by his own device and pride. Because people are fickle, and so are circumstances. Life is going to change quickly. Things happen like that. So like if you take sports, for example, I'll just quickly move through this. The Oklahoma City Thunder this season went from being a 7-1 chance at winning the NBA title to a 30-1 chance at winning the NBA title because one guy left the team. Right? Kevin Durant went and signed with the Warriors, and so they're like, oh, there's almost no chance that they're going to win the title. Right? There's just not. And all it took was one decision. 6 years ago, LeBron James left Cleveland. And they went from being contenders to being the worst team in the league. Multiple, number one picks in the NBA draft means your franchise is terrible. Like, if you watch soccer, I don't. You remember they had a soccer tournament a while ago, and that Ronaldo guy got hurt, and then they were like, oh, man, his team is in trouble. Right? That's the way it works. It's fickle. All it takes is one move for the bottom to fall out, and if you're not anchored, how do you plan on surviving the fallout? What's your plan? Because life can change very quickly for you. Now, hopefully that it changes quickly for you in a good sense. Hopefully it changes for you in the better, but it doesn't always. Haman's plan was to ride his favor with the king until he got everything that he wanted and wiped out all of his enemies. But the favor turned, and when the bottom fell out, Haman was hung on his own device. Because in his pride, he never would have dreamed that he could lose favor with the king. But he did. He never would have thought the king would have lost favor, that he would have been outside of the favor of the king. Never. But he found himself there. So as we kind of wrap up, I want to ask you something. What are you banking on? What are you counting on? Your skills? Your looks? Your intelligence? Your charm? Because those things are going to fade more quickly than you realize. And all you have left is your character, basically. Right? Because all the stuff that you're hoping in might come true, but it could just be gone like that. And if you're not anchored, then it's going to be a tough storm to weather. Right? So, I was a little older than y'all. I was 18. Michael, how old are you? 16? So I was 18 when I dropped out of high school. Right? Because I was going to pursue a career in music. Right? So I got my GED because I was like, if I'm going to be in a band and we're going to tour and we're going to do this, then school's going to get in the way. So I just need to get that out of the way. So I'll just get my GED and stop worrying about school. I had said, okay, I'm just going to go focus on this because I'm going to have a career in music. That's going to be my job. That's what I'm going to go do. Right? And it was okay. I mean, it looked promising for a while. For about a year and a half, we played every weekend. We traveled some. We were busy, right? Writing songs, doing stuff. But then I started having issues, right? My fingers would fall asleep, my hands would get all tingling, and I was like, this is weird. What's going on? So I went to the doctor, obviously, and they did something called an EMG, right? They test the nerves in your hands, and they were like, the doctor really was like, this is just a precaution. We're just going to check. It's probably nothing, but we're just going to check because you say you're having problems. You say all this. Basically, my opinion is the guy didn't believe me. He thought I was being dramatic. So the doctor comes back in, and he's like, I have never seen nerve damage like that. Like, not just in your age. Like, I've never seen that. Like, you have some serious nerve damage. Right? He's like, you have something called carpal tunnel syndrome. And what that does is it restricts the veins and nerves and everything in your hand. There's a band right here, and it was too tight, basically. And so it's putting too much pressure on my nerves and everything in my hands. And the doctor said, what's done is done. Like, that nerve damage is you can't go back from that. Like, those nerves are just permanently damaged. Like, forget about that. He's like, we can try to make it a little more comfortable, but you're always going to have those issues. And so I'm like, okay, well, at 18 years old, my career in music is effectively over, right? Because I could still play. I still stayed in the band. Like, I could play once a week or something like that. But you talk about every night, you talk about multiple practices, multiple cities. I was not going to be able to do that. Like, I knew at 18, I was like, my body's not going to let me do what I have decided to do with my life. Right? It's a fun message, because you're just like, well, all right, world, what do I do now? But, and the band broke up, never panned out or anything like that. I never fit into another band, so I just kind of faded out of that scene. I still played in worship bands and stuff, but that's a different scene. Like, it's a different thing. Like, playing worship music is a little different. But my point in saying that is I trusted my ability, and it failed. That's what I was banking on. I was trusting my ability to play bass and other instruments to be my career. Like, I was trusting in that. And then my body failed. Like, it just couldn't. Right? So 14 years later, I'm lucky if I get to play once a month. Right? I mean, if you fast forward, I'm like, man, it seems like either the media guy or the sound guy or somebody is out, and I'm always in the booth, right? Which is fine. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying it's funny how 14 years later it's so different, right? Because my career goals now, like what I care about, is making enough money to feed my family and keep my insurance, and then that's the minimum. Like, I'm like, okay, if I can do that, then I can do all this other stuff, right? So I'm like, my focus is really, keeping employed so I can keep my insurance and keep money for food on the table. But my goal really is ministry, right? That's what I want to do. So I finance it with a day job or whatever you want to call it. I never would have thought that 14 years ago. But life changes. Things change. And if you're not anchored in the Lord, what are you going to go to? Because He said, don't worry, I've got something else for you to do. Don't worry, I'm going to move you to do something else. Because in Proverbs 3, verse 5 and 6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him and He will make straight your path. So the point is, life is going to change. People are going to change. Your relationships are going to change. It's fickle. It changes pretty quickly, and you're not going to see it coming. But if you rest in the Lord, if you lean on Him and His understanding, He's going to make it all make sense. He's going to walk you through it. And that's the point of it. And that's really what Esther was doing, right? When she went and she fasted and prayed, she's like, all right, God, I'm just going to go get with you for 3 days and figure out what I'm supposed to do with all of this. Because it doesn't look good. And God's like, go be yourself. Go talk to the king. This is not a surprise to me. This is not an accident that you're here, Esther. Like, I set this up if you didn't realize. That's what God's saying to her. And so the point is, we have to trust in God and not yourself. You can't trust in yourself. You can't trust in your friends. You can't trust your potential. Because eventually all those things are going to fail you. God's the only one who's not going to fail you. Right? Now, I'm not intentionally going to fail you. Your parents aren't going to intentionally fail you. Your friends aren't going to intentionally fail you. But we're all human, and we all do. We all let people down. Right? And we don't like to think of it that way. But we've got to place our trust in Him. We've got to be anchored in the Lord, because life is going to change, and it's going to change quickly. And that's not a very light lesson. It's not a lot of fun necessarily to hear. But it's the truth. And the good news is, if you anchor yourself in him now, when those things change, they're not going to be nearly as scary. They're not going to be nearly as terrifying. Because you're going to say, I'm with the one who can calm the storm. So the storm is not as scary to me. Y'all have any questions?